basically, if power goes out, it's not the worst thing in the world because why do you keep freezing? I'm not talking about bodies. I'm talking about the video. Hey everybody, John Lorden here. It's Friday. You know what that means. Time for another episode of BrainScratch. Thank you so much for joining me here today. This one is a very interesting, it's not necessarily a case. This is more of a topic that I wanted to look into. I was watching an episode of Adam Ruins Everything. I'm sure many of you probably are familiar with that show. And if you've seen my work on this channel, I think you understand why I like that show. I love that they're citing their actual sources, which is, a huge thing that I really appreciate in terms of content that I look to and the content that I produce. But I was watching an episode particularly about death, and he had mentioned in one case talking about people that had been frozen right after their death with the expectation of coming back, and that there was a really bad occurrence that happened around that. And the way he described it to me sounded like it might have been a crime. So what we're looking into today are cryonics casualties. Is that a good name? I don't think so. How about Cryonics Catastrophes? There we go. So when I first started looking for this particular case that he was talking about, I started searching on the term cryogenics, and I quickly got schooled in cryogenics is not necessarily the same thing as cryonics. So let's learn a little bit more about what the differentiator is there. In physics, cryogenics is the production and behavior of materials at very low temperatures. A person who studies elements that have been subjected to extremely cold temperatures is called a cryogeneticist. So that doesn't necessarily mean you could have cryogeneticists that work with cryonics, but cryonics is the low temperature freezing specifically of a human corpse. So like for the company Dippin' Dots, that kind of ice cream company, they're getting into cryogenics, where they're basically looking to use their technology and apply it to different types of food that you could instantly freeze. That is much different than Dippin' Dots getting into cryonics, which I originally thought when I saw that article, and I was like, what? Why is Dippin' Dots doing this with bodies? They're not. The hope is that the resuscitation may be possible in the future. That's why they're freezing their bodies. It is regarded with skepticism within the mainstream scientific community and has been characterized as quackery. I've looked into many different articles about this because quite honestly, I just had probably the same level of understanding that most of you out there do. We've heard of science fiction stories about this. I don't know if Encino Man quite fits into this mold, but we've seen this type of story time and time again within fiction. Someone gets frozen, and at some later point, they thaw out. Captain America, for instance. I feel like I'm plugging Avengers Endgame, which, by the way, really, really good movie. Anyway, so what we have going on here is the hope. This is real. The hope that if I'm dying of something, let's say that I have some type of disease, I actually do die. As soon as I die, these experts are brought in and they start the process of freezing my body. Now, that's a real oversimplification because it's not just a matter of freezing your body. There's things that they're doing to try to preserve it as well. And, the freezing process, you don't want all the water molecules in your body to be frozen because all of a sudden they get very rigid, they expand in size, they could do a lot of damage. So there's processes they do where they essentially take the blood out of your body and they infuse other chemicals back into your body, including some drugs to try to help maintain the tissues that are being affected there while they're lowering your temperature. And then they get you to this particular temperature where they are then able to move you into a tank that they are continuously putting liquid nitrogen in. And they have to do that because liquid nitrogen is essentially vaporizing off the top of the liquid constantly. So the good thing is they don't need any type of electricity for this state. So if there's a power outage at a plant that has a bunch of these bodies in this kind of frozen is really not the right term. They refer to it as glassy vitrification. I don't want to get too technical with all this stuff, but just know that essentially they're trying to get your tissues to a state where the cold is keeping them preserved, but it is not truly freezing them. It's not rupturing them and doing all the typical damage that you would see there. So this is something that, sure, it sounds like sci-fi, but it's really happening. There's bodies that are sitting in tanks right now in this state. There's companies like this one. They are also in the process here caring for people in the San Francisco Bay Area and nationally. And what does caring mean? Many people have so much they want to do with their lives, but sometimes illnesses such as cancer or heart disease prevent them from doing all they set out to do. TransTime cares for people while the medical treatment for their illness can be discovered. How do they do that? Cryonics. Cryonics is the science of placing humans into a low temperature, biologically unchanging state immediately after clinical death, with the expectation that advances in medical technology will eventually enable full restoration to life and health. So it's really tough because, there's kind of this oversimplification here that isn't this just for like rich people that want to come back in, a cloned body that is 25 years old so they can relive their youth and jump into the future and, take advantage of all the things that are there at that time? Not necessarily. I've bumped into stories while researching today's episode where you're talking about a 14-year-old girl that's dying of cancer and really hasn't had a full life, and she's looking at this as a possible option. I've even seen a story, the youngest person I think so far is just over 2 years of age that has been put into this process, once again, because of brain cancer in that particular case. So the humanity that's moving people to making this decision, I certainly understand, I certainly support. I don't know about the science aspect of it. I did find one article I'll let you guys know about at the end of this that I think is a pretty interesting read. Actually, let me just jump to some of it right now because it explains a little bit of what goes on in this process. It's at a website called Wait But Why. And it's interesting because you kind of get the sense, it's a really long article, but you get the sense that the author is going through a transition of really not being much of a believer. And then by the end, he's actually ready to sign up. Like he's making appointments to learn more about this. But here they have a couple of important distinctions on this graph. I'm not exactly sure why they have the arrow going this way. I really found that confusing, but it actually starts from the left and it goes to the right. So they're showing that your life starts, there's aging and deterioration. At some point there is clinical death, which is where the heart stops and breathing stops, but that is not still necessarily legal death because, resuscitation can happen at that point. You can still die a clinical death and be brought back. So at the point of legal death is when there are no resuscitation options left. Basically, when modern medicine runs out, then they say you are legally dead. Now, somewhere right after the clinical death or even beyond the legal death is where this cryonics window is. And that is essentially them getting their experts to wherever you are and starting this process of replacing your body fluids. I think they actually hook up a machine that is essentially giving you a type of CPR while this is going on. They're doing everything they can to preserve the state of your body, not allow deterioration to happen, get the fluids swapped, start lowering your temperature, and get you to that ideal temperature of, if I remember right, it's negative 192 degrees Celsius, something around there. But even they have a window where there's a certain point, if it's been too long and they're not able to get there in time, where there's what they call info death. And that means there is no possibility of current or even future technology being able to retrieve the information from the brain. Really interesting article. If any of this has been interesting to you guys so far, I recommend that you check out this article. I'll have it at the top of the sources list. It takes some time to get through, but it's a really interesting read. You will learn a lot about this whole process. So how did this process start? Let's go to The Guardian and learn a little bit about that. Cryonics was first proposed in the 1960s by a Michigan professor, Robert Ettinger, in a book called The Prospect of Immortality, which argued that death could, in fact, be a reversible process. Ettinger, who died in 2011, went on to found the Cryonics Institute in Michigan, where he, his mother, and his first and second wives all now reside in metal flasks kept at minus 196 degrees Celsius. Sorry, I got that wrong before. I just have to stop right there. I think there is a good writing opportunity for someone to do a stage play or something specifically about this guy being resuscitated with his mother and his first and second wives. What type of conversation is going to happen at the point where they all are brought back and are able to talk to each other? I'm really surprised at the future that some people are trying to plan for themselves. Hey, I'm going to have both my first and my second wife there. While the concept has never become mainstream, the number of people choosing to sign up is steadily increasing year on year. There are now nearly 300 cryogenically frozen individuals in the U.S., another 50 in Russia, and a few thousand prospective candidates signed up. Some of those candidates do include celebrities. Britney Spears has a plan. Paris Hilton has a plan. There's a couple of other ones, but once again, I'm just wondering what happens in the future where people resuscitate these people and then Paris Hilton's like, oh, good, I made it. Okay, no one remembers who you are anymore, and what are you going to do in the future? I don't know. As you can see, I'm still struggling with this whole thought. I think the angle of being displaced, like, I get that people enjoy life and that people want to live as long of a life as possible. I just don't know if I would enjoy it being in a completely different time, and everything that I love about this life is no longer here. And I've got all these things that I've been wired for in terms of my happiness. I love watching certain types of television shows, or I love being around these people. All that stuff is all completely gone. It's essentially starting a new life out in the future at some point. And is there a benefit to that or not for a 2.5-year-old that never got to live life in the first place? Certainly. And I really struggle with this because I keep looking at the different situations. People dying of cancer at 14 or at 23. You know, I don't know. I'm really moved by that. I'm really touched by that. And I do think that this is kind of it's weird to call it a lifeline, but it's kind of just a last ditch effort to live some aspects of your life that you weren't able to do here in the present. I just wonder how effective that's going to be if you're talking about even 50 years down the road. Things are going to be considerably different socially. Are you going to fit into that? Do you have to go to work at that point? How do you take care of yourself? They don't even really have a decent plan here for, like, how is it going to be funded, the actual I think they cover the resuscitation, but let's say that they have that covered. What about the expenses for repairing whatever was wrong with you, for curing the cancer that you had or something along those lines? Who's going to pay for that aspect of it? I don't know. So there's a lot of logistics to this that I don't quite understand. And there's a little bit of looking into the past that can teach us some things that might be problems to come up again in the future. So we're going to do that as we move into one particular topic here. But let's continue here with The Guardian. So there are 3 major facilities in the world for doing this right now. And the first one, the website I showed you, TransTime, isn't even on this list. As I understand it, TransTime has kind of been reduced at this point. I don't even know if they're taking new clients. I think they're taking pets only at this point. It seems like they're down to a skeleton crew of people that are literally just topping off these tanks and making sure that they're not going to go bankrupt at this point, which obviously is probably one of the biggest risks in all this. What if the company that your body's stored with goes bankrupt? Then what happens? once again, I think the past is going to tell us a little bit more about that. But let's see. So the world's 3 major facilities, 2 are in the U.S., and then there's Cryo-Rus, a Russian center on the outskirts of Moscow. They all offer slightly different prices. Alcor has a reputation for celebrity clients. Alcor is the one that I think Britney Spears and Paris Hilton are with. While Cryo-Rus offers budget service, probably due to its communal approach to storage, with bodies sharing tanks with a menagerie of 20 or so pets. So Alcor, I've seen a lot of pictures of it. I'm pretty sure the thumbnail for this video is going to be a picture from Alcor. You're essentially in a giant metal tube, something that looks almost like a water heater. The bodies that are in it are actually stored upside down because as the liquid nitrogen evaporates off the top, if there was some type of emergency where they weren't able to refill it on time, they're really trying their best to preserve your brain. So they keep your brain as low in the tank as possible. Cryo-Rus, it sounds like they're using larger storage tanks, but having multiple people in that same storage tank. So certainly a bit of a different approach. The companies all use the same basic technology. First, the body is obtained as soon as possible after death, packed in ice, and transported to the facility. Here, the blood is drained and replaced with a mixture of antifreeze and organ-preserving chemicals. This transforms the corpse into a glassy, vitrified state, ready to be lowered into liquid nitrogen at a temperature of minus 196 degrees Celsius. Cryo-Rus charges $36,000 for whole body storage or $18,000 for just the head. Now, I know that sounds kind of weird to many of you, but one of the possible scenarios that they're imagining is by the time you are being resuscitated, maybe it'll be possible that maybe there's a robotic body, maybe there is a cloned body. There's going to be some type of other mechanism for your brain to be used in some form of body, or a virtualized environment where essentially your brain is resuscitated and then possibly transferred into some type of electronic apparatus where, you can live in the Matrix or something along those lines. Alcor charges $200,000 for the full body and $80,000 for head-only preservation, and also offers the option of clients taking out life insurance that will pay out the company. And that article that I had mentioned previously at Wait But Why, they kind of go into this as well. This is not just for rich people anymore. Essentially, if you're young enough, you can take out a life insurance policy and you have Alcor named as the beneficiary. And as long as you do that for the right amount, they are then going to go ahead and put you into this process. So something that, quite honestly, anyone out there can do if you're so interested to do it. So how did this all start, and who is the person that's been in this process the longest? The first suspension, this is an article actually written at Alcor's own website, and they've got a ton of information that you can dive into here if you want to learn much more about the ethics around this, their approach to it. Even this article goes into some of the not so good situations that have happened as this, I guess you can call it a technology, as this process has developed. But the first suspension is Dr. James Bedford, and it took place in January 1967. They're saying it was the first, albeit crude, cryonic suspension. The big event occurred January 12, 1967 in Glendale, a Los Angeles suburb. Bedford was a 73-year-old retired psychology professor who had written several books on occupational counseling. The freezing was carried out by affiliates of the newly formed Cryonics Society of California. Robert Prehota, author and cryobiological researcher, Dr. Dante Brunel, physician and biophysicist, and Robert Nelson, president of the society. And that guy, Robert Nelson, he's the president of the society. You would figure he must have some type of good experience, some good qualifications to be doing this, right? He's the guy that we're going to look into the most today, and possibly someone I'm wondering, is he a criminal or not at this point? Let's dive into, this is actually a transcript of, I think it's a radio show called This American Life. I'm going to have links down below to both the transcript and the audio version. The audio version, I think if you listen to all the parts, I think it comes up close to 3 hours. We definitely don't need to go into it that in depth. There is one particular story I'm trying to tell here, so let's go ahead and jump into that. But they did a really good job on research on all of this, so I wanted to point that out. This American Life. Many scientific advances begin with amateur enthusiasts. It was the 1960s. A Michigan college professor named Robert Ettinger wrote a book posing a simple question: what if death itself was just another disease? If you could freeze somebody at the exact moment of clinical death, maybe, just maybe, in 50 years or 100 years or 1,000, the doctors of the future could bring them back to life. This was cryonics, or cryonic suspension, and groups of enthusiasts began to spring up here and there, which is how Bob Nelson got involved. It came on the radio that there was going to be the first meeting of the suspended animation group. I remember going there thinking I'm probably not going to be allowed in because I'm not a scientist. I was allowed in, and I came out voted president. That's Bob Nelson. Bob had no medical or scientific training whatsoever, hadn't even finished high school. He was a 30-year-old TV repairman with a wife and 3 kids. Bob sincerely believed that cryonics was going to save millions of lives. The members of Bob's group weren't experts, they were just fans of an idea. They set up a nonprofit, the Cryonics Society of California. They wanted to take things slow, conduct research, publish papers, and that was fine with Bob, until he got a call from the son of a psychology professor who was dying of cancer, a man who couldn't wait for the research to pan out. His name was James Bedford. Dr. Bedford wanted to be frozen. Bob got on the phone with the godfather of the movement, the guy that wrote the book, Robert Ettinger. Ettinger said, "We need to go ahead and do it. There's nothing that will push the program of cryonics forward more than the freezing of the first man." Bob assembled a team of doctors. Bedford died on January 12, 1967. A year and a half later, a member of their own group turned up at the morgue wearing a medical bracelet saying she was supposed to be frozen. Her name was Mary Sweet. Here's a quote from Bob. "I was a nervous wreck because I'm thinking, I don't know how many violations I'm committing here. For example, a dead body legally can only be moved by a mortician. And then I had no idea if I was committing any violations by having the body up in our offices and putting her in ice there and then carrying her down the stairs." The goal was to get Mary into a giant stainless steel container cooled by liquid nitrogen. A cryonics buff in Arizona had started building capsules for exactly this purpose. That's where Dr. Bedford ended up, sent there by his son after the first freezing. But it wasn't clear where to send Marie. The Cryonics Society had no place to keep a frozen body. That was going to cost a lot of money. Marie Sweet's husband managed to scrape together a few $100s. That's it. And the society was broke. What the society did have was a lot of enthusiastic members, all of them also hoping to be suspended. "I kept thinking that it's going to work," said Bob. "So it just seemed that it was worth going just a little bit further. I never intended with Marie Sweet to forever keep her in preservation at my own expense." What happened next is another member of the society died, Helen Klein. Helen Klein followed Marie Sweet to a mortuary in the city of Buena Park, where Bob had jerry-rigged a temporary storage container. When they ship a casket, Bob states, it's the outer box, the wooden box that they ship them in. And we would put styrofoam on the sides and on the top, and they make excellent refrigeration units. In other words, he was putting them in a giant cooler filled with a lot of dry ice. The problem was dry ice is expensive, so he made what seemed like a simple decision at the time. We had a container with a lady and dry ice already. Didn't cost any more to put this little lady in there. So essentially we have this second woman that has now passed away. She's supposed to be put into this suspended process as well. He only has one box where he's keeping Marie Sweet, And now he decides Helen Klein, well, we'll just put her in the same box. Maintaining the cooler was a big job, but Bob didn't really see an alternative. Every week or so, he put hundreds of pounds of dry ice in the back seat of his little vintage Porsche and drove 2 hours from Woodland Hills to the mortuary in Buena Park. Now, this mortuary in Buena Park, what room were they being stored in? It was actually the garage. And there was a person that was working there. He was basically telling Bob, this is temporary, right? We can't keep them here. And Bob just kind of kept, yeah, sure, telling him what he wanted to hear and then avoiding him a little bit. It's already a crazy situation. Whenever I look at this story, I get this weird feeling like the first time I read Frankenstein. I get like the same feeling, like there's just something seriously morbid and what's the hope here exactly? Like, I really lose track of what are we trying to do? Is it just that we're trying to put someone on ice and we're just trying to keep them frozen for the sake of them being frozen? Or do we really believe in this, that at some point, if we do all this, that they're going to be brought back to life and their illness is cured or de-aged or whatever they're hoping for? And that's another thing with this story. There's a lot of people that come up in this story that are pretty late in their years. So I don't know that it would necessarily be enough to bring them back and then, sure, you cure their cancer, but they're 80 years old. What then? Are we also hoping that it's far enough in the future so we can do some type of de-aging process to them or something? I don't know. And I'm sure those issues are extremely unique or personal to the individuals. I'm sure there's some people where maybe they would be happy just for another 5 years. And there's others where maybe that is their expectation, that technology will be so good that they'll get another 50 years out of life or more. I'm not sure. So a third member of the society then died unexpectedly, Russ Stanley, a man in a position to possibly solve all of Bob's problems. Here's Bob again. Russ Stanley used to call me at home every night and drive me nuts on the telephone for an hour, sometimes 2 hours. To him, there was nothing else in life but cryonics, and assuring me always that when he died, the society would be in good shape. Russ used to always say, "I'm loaded. I own my own house." So I expected him to leave a couple $100,000 or something. He left his money to his next door neighbor, who was his ex-lover, a Mr. Coco. Mr. Coco hated cryonics. So he called me about 3 or 4 days after we had Russ in dry. We put him in the container too. Let me just stop you guys there. So he has one container. He's now got 2 women and he's now put Russ in there as well. 3 bodies in one container. So now we got 3 people in this dry ice container. I couldn't put any more in there, but I figured, well, this was going to save the day. But Mr. Coco said, Russ Stanley directed me to give the Cryonics Society $5,000 now and $5,000 in 3 months. It was enough money at least to solve Bob's most pressing problem. He bought a plot of land and built a vault in a cemetery in Chatsworth, 30 miles north of LA, a 15 by 20 room dug like a bunker into a gently sloping hillside. So thankfully, at least he's getting out of the garage at the first place, and now he's actually building a facility for this. But at this point, he still just has the one container. Mrs. Marie Bowers was a housewife from Detroit. A few years back, her father had died, and she had arranged to have him frozen by a man named Ed Hope, another kind of pioneer in this industry, the same guy who was storing Dr. Bedford, the first man frozen. Her father had spent 1.5 years there in a one-man capsule the size of a standard water heater. Now, as it turned out, Marie was in a fix of her own. She couldn't pay the storage that Ed Hope was charging. She couldn't pay for the liquid nitrogen. So she calls Bob. And I went, well, wait, boy, if I could put a couple people in that capsule, if I could get them all in there, I didn't know if 4 people would fit in one capsule. Boy, that would solve my problem, and it would solve her problem. And again, that's probably the only thing that I'm somewhat ashamed about, that I didn't tell her that I was going to put 3 more people in there. I didn't think it was necessary to burden her with that. The complex problem of her dad being coupled with other people might have been a problem for her. I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't have been. So he knows that the dry ice thing has to end. I mean, he's just spending tons of money just getting enough dry ice there, and he's doing it day after day after day. He also knows he's got them essentially in a wooden box with some styrofoam around the edges of it. So this is his first shot to actually get a real cryogenic or a cryonic container. And then he's hoping he could just put all the bodies he has into this legit container, and then everything should be fine from there. So what happens? The capsule arrived at the mortuary in Buena Park in the spring of 1969. A cryonic container is basically a giant thermos, one steel tube inside another with a vacuum in between. So long as you added liquid nitrogen once every few months, the tank stayed really cold. These containers weren't designed to be open and shut again. So when the time came to add the extra bodies, Bob had to improvise. He drained the liquid nitrogen and had a welder open the capsule with a blowtorch. They spent most of the night unsealing the tank and arranging the bodies, which they wrapped head to toe in Mylar. So he's already misusing the design of this tank, and in doing that, you know, you've got two layers that you're cutting through, and it's important to have that vacuum in between because that is essentially stopping any transference of heat from the outside to the inner layer of the tank. But now he's cut through both of those layers. So unless this welder is amazing and able to completely reseal both layers perfectly, and then they need some type of mechanism, some vacuum to suck out the air that's in between those two layers. If they don't get all that perfect, then the main way that they insulate this container has just been blown. And essentially, that's a bit of what happens. Let's go ahead and continue here. But first he has to move the bodies, right? I had to have gloves on because the body is like steel. And 300 degrees below zero, it's like holding a pot that's 300 degrees above zero. You can't do it. And it took probably a couple hours to get them so that everyone was comfortably arranged. So he did. He wound up stuffing all those bodies into that container. Then they sealed the container back up. But the capsule Bob had pinned his hopes on needed round-the-clock attention. Here's another comment from him. We had to keep a pump, an electronic pump, pulling the vacuum 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At Chatsworth, the temperatures got up to over 100, 110 degrees Fahrenheit sometimes, and that was death to these vacuum pumps. They couldn't take that heat. The pumps would burn out and need to be replaced, and it just got worse and worse and worse. I was there, I would say, virtually every day. So the pump is basically a way that he's trying to mitigate. Obviously, there's not a perfect seal. Something has broke between either the outer shell or the inner shell, and that vacuum that he needs to be between those two isn't holding. So he's just hooking up a pump to it. The pumps are running continuously. Of course, they're going to blow out. And I used to live in Chatsworth for a while, and it certainly got extremely warm there, particularly in the summer. And it was California, so you know the summer felt like at least half the year, and it never really cooled off all that much. So he's refilling the tank with coolant at a few $100 a pop. Sometimes he wrote checks from his personal bank account. Sometimes the checks would bounce. Meanwhile, he's also flying around the country, giving lectures, showing off artist renderings of the futuristic cryonics facility he had planned to build. He appeared on radio and TV talk shows with Regis Philbin, Phil Donahue. Another comment from Bob. The dual role of my life was to, on the one hand, be a spokesman for cryonics, and then, on the other hand, was my nightmare responsibility of keeping this antique capsule running. The publicity worked. It attracted new people to be frozen, some of them with the ability to pay for it. In July of 1971, Bob got a call from a Canadian man named Guy. If it's French, he probably pronounces it Guy. The father of a 7-year-old girl dying of a rare kidney cancer. The way Guy saw it, it didn't matter if cryonics was a long shot. Bob Nelson presented the only slim hope his daughter had left. Bob knew he shouldn't be performing another free suspension, but he couldn't help it. He had a daughter of his own. According to Bob, Guy hoped to raise $10,000 to pay for a capsule, but he just couldn't manage it. Bob did the only thing he knew how to do. In 1972, he arranged to take custody of a cryonics patient named Stephen Mandel, who'd been frozen and sealed in a capsule specifically for him in New York. He gets the capsule, he opens it up, he adds Genevieve, the daughter, and another woman he'd frozen, Mildred Harris, and then welded it shut again. By now, the first capsule was breaking down more or less constantly, and Bob had hit a wall. It was as if he was on a sinking ship. He couldn't save them all, so he'd come to a decision. He would let the first capsule fail, but he'd also keep that a secret. The second capsule was practically as bad as the first. I don't see how it couldn't have been. He did the same thing. He basically got a welder and broke down the integrity of the vacuum seal again. Constantly malfunctioning, boiling off liquid nitrogen. A few years later, he had to leave town for a week. He paid a groundskeeper $100 to babysit the capsule, and the pump broke. And the groundskeeper called the company to fix it, but the company never showed up. So here's a quote from Bob. "I came back, drove up to the vaults, looked at the capsule. There is a nozzle that comes out of the capsule that has steam visible because the liquid nitrogen is evaporating away. That steam wasn't there. The test was to go and touch that pipe. And if it was cold, then there was some hope. So I walk up to the capsule, I put my finger on it, and it was like touching a hot frying pan. It was the most painful, emotional experience of my life. I had failed that little girl. I promised her dad, and she was gone." Bob had just discovered that a second freezing capsule has failed. He says the first person that he went to tell was the little girl Genevieve's father. Bob then says that he flew to see Terry Harris, whose mother Mildred Harris was in the second capsule with Genevieve, and whose father Gaylord was also in the vault. Guy, Genevieve's father, says Bob never came out. And this article goes into much more about the actual meeting. Bob says that they met up at an airport. They were at a diner or a coffee shop. The person that's working on this story actually reached out, and Guy says, no, none of that ever happened. I didn't hear from Bob about this at all. Terry, the other person that Bob says he flew out to see, also says Bob never told him about the failure of the capsule. He never came out and saw him. Terry actually learned about it from an article in a California newspaper. When the truth about the 2 failed capsules and the 9 bodies in the vault finally came to light, when all those hard decisions Bob had made on the fly became sound bites on the 10 o'clock news, there wasn't just a public reckoning, there was a trial. Terry and his brother were 2 of the plaintiffs, and they won to the tune of $800,000. So they also sued the mortician that helped Bob store the bodies at the first location. He had malpractice insurance, and essentially from this lawsuit, they got about $400,000 from the malpractice insurance. I don't know if they ever received anything from Bob. This article doesn't really go into it, but considering that this guy's, basically broke himself trying to keep these capsules running, I doubt they got anything. In 1979, the Harris brothers flew out to California to meet an attorney who led them to the vault at Chatsworth, along with a local TV news team. By that point, Bob had washed his hands of the Cryonics Society. He was dead broke. His marriage had fallen apart. He just walked away. So this is now a quote from Terry going to the facility. The door in the facility was made of steel, and it was then chained and padlocked closed. The chain was rusty, and there was grass growing around that door where before it wasn't. Our attorney brought a pair of bolt cutters and removed the lock and chain and slid the door back, and we went down, and you could just see that there was a piece of equipment here and there, and the capsule lid open. We had brought flowers, and so we laid them there by the capsule, and then I just went up the stairs and left. Where the vault used to be, now there's just an empty swath of grass. The reporter actually went there with Bob, and that's where this information's coming from. He says that the padlock opening isn't there anymore. There's no monument or plaque of any kind. He's assuming that the bodies were still probably left in there. But here's a quote from Bob. See where the ground rises up over here? This is where the vault is. They've put 2 benches right here. Bob says all but 2 of the people he froze are still sealed in the vault, now covered over with sod. But the cemetery management tells a different story. They say the bodies were all disinterred years ago, which leaves one final question. So Bob says most of the bodies are down there. The actual management of the cemetery says, no, they're not. Where are they? What happened to them? Who removed them and why? And this is really the question for today's Brain Scratch. Is this a crime at this point? Yes, these are people that were dead. I understand that. But isn't there at least manipulation of a corpse or some other type of charge that could be applied around this? Is there some type of loophole that Bob has worked out on this? Let's continue. Terry Harris comments, I have no idea where my parents are. The management of the cemetery said, well, they're gone. And I said, well, what do you mean gone? And he said that one day a big pickup truck came up there and disinterred them and took them away. This is where all Bob's secrets and lies about the bodies finally led. To Terry Harris making phone calls, writing letters, combing through legal documents. Somewhere he figured there had to be a record, a clue that would tell him what had become of his parents. He never found it. Cryonics carried on without Bob Nelson, and all these years later, when people in the field tell Bob's story, they call it the Chatsworth disaster. When Bob talks about those years, he says he's gotten a bad rap. He'll tell you that his main mistake was caring too much, that the secrets he kept were necessary to keep the project going, and above all, that the people he froze had donated their bodies under the Anatomical Gift Act. As I learned more about this process today, this is something that's still going on with this process, at least for the companies here in the US. If you want to do this process, you're essentially going to have to sign over your body to science. And that is seemingly the loophole that Bob's using here. Here's a comment from him specifically about it, which meant that they donated their body to the Cryonics Society of California. And according to my attorney, we could grind them up for hamburger if that's what we wanted to do. Now, I just want to stop there and say, what is this guy doing? Everything that he's gone through, and even looking at it, I kind of have mixed feelings about him. Like, I have this feeling of, I know he's trying to do something that he really, really believes in, but man, is he blowing it. And he's blowing it, and he's blowing it, and he's making a bad situation worse time and time again. And then you're doing a piece about this years later for a radio show and for broadcast, and you're going to throw a quote like that out there? We could grind them up for hamburger if that's what we wanted to do? I want to believe that he still believed in this process, that he thought he was saving these people's lives. But when you're then talking about their bodies in that manner, I don't know that I believe that. I think he's talking about them just as biological waste at that point. So yeah, I'm really confused by that comment. I think that's a very telling statement in this whole thing. We were given the right by the state of California to carry on research and do whatever we wanted in the perfection of suspended animation. And so we just felt there's no need to be telling other people. I could have just locked that vault up and not told anybody that we had stopped putting liquid nitrogen in there. That probably could have gone on until today. But at some point, I had to settle back down to reality. Kind of interesting, because I'm not sure that I feel like he still has dealt with the reality of this situation. Bob's not a rich guy, but he's managed to save $28,000 to pay for his own freezing at the Cryonics Institute in Michigan. He thinks his odds of reanimation are pretty good. I personally wish they would reanimate his humanity, because it really seems like he lost something there. That last comment, just, I don't get it. I don't get it for someone that seemed like he was really trying to help with something that he believed in, to boil things down to that simple of a statement. I don't know. I'm just not impressed. But let's continue here. That's not the only bad thing that has happened around this process. We also have the story of Beverly Greenberg, who went by the stage name Jillian Cummings. This is another story coming from Alcor's website themselves, and it's related to her father dying, Herman Greenberg. He was stored in a capsule. Greenberg's daughter Beverly, who used the stage name Jillian Cummings, was only in her teens when he suddenly died, but fought vigorously to arrange his cryopreservation, which involved digging his newly buried body out of the ground with the help of a backhoe. Beverly pursued a career in filmmaking as far as her meager finances allowed while working at odd jobs and living frugally to make ends meet. Her freelance lifestyle came to a tragic end in November 1973 when she died under mysterious circumstances at the CSNY facility, possibly a victim of hypothermia. So that's the facility where her father's body was stored. She had been sleeping in her truck in the unheated building only a few feet from her father's capsule. At the time, she had not made suspension arrangements, even though she was the vice president of CSNY and clearly wanted the procedure for herself. But none of her living relatives were interested in cryonics or making the payments. Her father was reburied, and she, for her trouble, was cremated. And CSNY is the Cryonics Society of New York. So, once again, if we look at Bob's story, the finances were never figured out. He wasn't even close to getting the financial aspect of all that working. This story points to a little bit of a different problem. They now know that there's a financial component that they have to take care of as they're maintaining the status of these bodies. But what they initially do is they set up kind of payment systems with the family members. And I've seen several examples of this where, the families will pay that monthly payment or yearly payments for that preservation for a period of time, and then they'll stop. And then what happens? Bodies are thawed and then they are buried after that. So the financial model, as you're looking at what's happening through the late 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, is certainly not figured out. There's a lot of deficiencies to it, and it's causing a lot of pretty terrible situations to happen here. But this is where things get even dicier. This is an article at news.com.au. According to Alcor's website, the greatest crisis in the history of the company occurred after the death of Dora Kent, the mother of one of its board members. It happened when the 83-year-old retired dressmaker came down with pneumonia in December of 1987, and death seemed imminent. As Alcor states, a fateful decision was made to bring her into the facility before she deanimated. Alcor decided to only suspend Mrs. Kent's neuro, her head. However, the local coroner became interested and conducted an autopsy on the headless body, concluded initially that death was from natural causes, likely pneumonia, but then reversed his decision and accused Alcor's team of murder. He demanded and was refused the head for autopsy, and Alcor staff were handcuffed, detained, pursued, but eventually exonerated. So I've seen a little more detail on this story. Essentially what the theory is that she wasn't quite dead yet. She was still alive when she was brought into their facility, and possibly some drugs or some process was administered to her that ended her life, and then she was put into the freezing process immediately. And there's some other stuff around this. There's one case of someone that's kind of famous, a baseball player. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him, but there's an employee that worked there, I think, for a matter of just months. I think he was only there for about 8 months or so. And he wrote a book about all this. He also talked about a particular instance where a man who was dying of AIDS, and the Alcor staff goes to this man, and they're waiting for him to expire. And this guy says that he wasn't expiring fast enough, and someone got frustrated, and they basically gave him a shot of something, and then he's gone, and they're taking his body off. Now, I don't think any of that has panned out. I'm pretty sure Alcor sued that guy. I don't think the lawsuit went through, the former employee of theirs. So I don't know. This is certainly a whole different territory. I mean, if you're talking about them being involved in the ending of these lives, that's a much different place. And I'm just calling those out because these are stories that are around this, but I don't have a whole lot of more information about the validity of these stories. Now, currently, I think the most famous person that is in this process is a man named Ted Williams. He is a baseball player, former Boston Red Sox, I believe. This is an article from Mental Floss. Ted Williams is without a doubt the most famous cryogenically frozen person. His son, John Henry Williams, was adamant that his father wanted to be preserved and wanted his whole family to follow suit so they could be reunited. However, Ted's will said that he wanted to be cremated, and his daughter, by his first wife, took John Henry to court over the matter. John Henry then produced a family pact signed on a cocktail napkin. After much debate over authenticity, the napkin pact was allowed. There is a good article at Sports Illustrated. I'm going to include that in the sources down below that goes into all this. I didn't know Sports Illustrated would even write articles of this nature, but the family dynamics around this type of stuff can also be really tough. And I think this is a really good example of that, especially when you have a will saying that, yeah, he plans on being cremated. But the cocktail napkin agreement seemed to have turned it around. Now, his son that made all that happen, and by the way, if I recall correctly, I think they've only preserved Ted's head. His son also passed away, John Henry Williams. Ted's son stayed true to his word. Despite a bone marrow transplant from his sister, John Henry died of leukemia on March 6, 2004, and joined his dad at Alcor in Scottsdale, Arizona. Now, I know we've been focusing a lot on Alcor, but this isn't only about them. There are other areas where there's catastrophes, cryo-catastrophes, I guess we can call them. This is another article from The Guardian. Raymond Martineau and his wife were the toast of the world cryonics movement. For years, they were France's best preserved corpses, lying in a freezer in a chateau. But the French couple's journey into the future ended prematurely when 22 years after his mother's body was put into cold storage, their son discovered the freezer unit had broken down and they started to thaw. Yesterday, and this is an article, I think it's from 2006. Yesterday, Remy Martineau said that he had no choice but to cremate his parents' body after the technical fault. There was an alarm that was built into this, but apparently the alarm did not go off. It should have notified them that there was a problem with the refrigeration unit. The alarm also failed. I don't feel any more bereaved today than I did when my parents died. I had already done my grieving, but I feel bitter that I could not respect my father's last wishes. Maybe the future would have shown that my father was right and that he was a pioneer. Now, this is one of the more current articles I could find in terms of some type of cryo-catastrophe happening. Son horrified when cryogenic firm cuts off his father's head. According to a lawsuit filed by his son, Kurt Pilgrim, cryogenics company Alcor froze only the elder Pilgrim's head after his death when he had signed a contract to have his entire body preserved. Alcor sent him a package purportedly containing the cremated remains of the father's body after the scientist's death in 2015 at age 90. The son, who is seeking $1 million in damages, says Alcor told him the body was medically unable to be preserved. He accuses the company of preying on the elderly and says it is unlikely its customers can ever be resurrected. Once again, I feel like we have a family member having a difference of belief in this process. I've seen several other instances where Alcor or other companies are saying that they will preserve a full body. In some cases, they'll separate the head and preserve that separately. I don't know why, but they'll preserve the head in one way, they'll preserve the body in another, and they'll just hold on to both. I really don't know why you would keep the body, especially with this mentality that they offer a service just for essentially trying to preserve the brain for some type of, reconstruction effort of a body or some type of virtualized environment. I don't know, but I'm just telling you guys what I bumped into. So is there any good news around all this? Is there any hope for this as a technology? There's one article that is referred to in several places from 2016. Here's Newsweek talking about it. Rabbit brain returns successfully from cryopreservation. That is not the real brain. That is just some artist. You can tell it actually looks kind of cheesy to me. It is a representation. So in this instance, they did put a rabbit brain through a bit of a modified process, not exactly the same process that we've been talking about here. At its core nature it is, but I think the chemicals that they used were different. They then thawed it out and they kind of sliced it up and checked it out under a microscope. And from what they could see, they had done a perfect preservation job. Not quite the same as what we're expecting, for them to have thought it out and, maybe tested it in some way where they could, I don't even know what you would do with it. What would you do with it? Put it in another rabbit's body? I mean, it's just, I don't think the technology is quite there for that level, but in terms of a more simple test of them looking at it under a microscope and being able to determine if it was still in the same state, they are confident that it was. They've also won a prize for this from the Brain Preservation Foundation. It was a prize of like $26,000, the Small Mammal Brain Preservation Prize. So, could this be a legit technology? Things like this could be pointing to the possibility. And we still have the guy that we started this whole thing with. Cool dude James Bedford has been cryonically frozen for 50 years. That was January 11th. Should have been January 12th, actually, 2017. At one point, they did move him from one container to another, and they checked him at that time. They checked his status, and they said they saw some minor, very, very small cracking that was happening in some of his skin. But other than that, it looked like a perfect preservation. At some point, will Dr. Bedford be resurrected or put into a new body or put into some type of virtualized environment? I don't know. But for 50 years, he's been in a cryo chamber, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. What do you think, Brain Scratchers? I'm putting it to you. There's a lot to talk about this. What do you guys think about this whole process? Is it realistic? Is it feasible? Is it ethical? I don't know. We're already dealing with people that have passed away. So at this point, from one perspective, you can just talk about that it's handling the corpse in a different way. Is it any worse than putting a corpse through an embalming procedure and then stuffing it in the ground? Or burning it up? I don't know. I don't feel like it's necessarily worse than any of those other processes. Is it worse because there's an expectation that you're going to come out of it at some point? Is someone taking advantage of that expectation? I think that's kind of the bigger question. And there's no hard answer, at least that I can see, because they're essentially relying on technology and processes and medical advances that are not here yet. It's the promise of the future that is being sold to these people. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it, but I keep considering those people that are having their lives ended much too young. I kind of feel differently about those cases for some reason than the 90-year-old man wanting to be frozen and brought back to life. There's something about, a 2-year-old girl, a 14-year-old girl, a 23-year-old woman. Those stories are really resonating with me in terms of this process. But once again, wouldn't that make it even worse if this was really just someone taking advantage of them? And when we look at Bob's comments, man, that last comment just makes me feel like I don't know where his heart was in that whole place. But a lot to talk about. Please join the conversation in the comments below, and I'll ask that we respect each other's opinion. This definitely treads into belief territory. I don't think there's hard and fast answers that we're going to be able to throw around on this one. It's certainly something for people to look into. Maybe you'll consider it for yourself. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll look into it and decide that it isn't the right thing for you. I just have this feeling that, death is a part of life, and even if there was a pause button you could kind of hit with it, at some point it's still going to happen, right? Unless there's that expectation, I'm trying to freeze myself until you can thaw me out and then I can live forever. I don't know. What do you guys think? Let's talk about all that in the comments below. And before I go, I have to thank several new patrons that are now supporting the channel, starting with Alexandra Serrano, Nick Harvell, Saida, hope I'm saying that right, Sissy Turner, Sid Gorham Aitken, Michelle Bell, and Foxlore. On top of that, Jennifer, Gia, and Helen increased their pledges. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, keeping me here doing what I love doing. Hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. I know it's a little bit different. Just trying to make sure I get in what I consider old school brain scratches every now and then. And I think this topic kind of feels like it fits that to me. If you have other suggestions for brain scratches in that old school nature, more topic based instead of individual case based, feel free to let me know at Twitter at LordenArts, or drop them in the comments below, or you can go to lordenarts.com, go down to the comment box at the very bottom, put them in there. Being honest with you guys, the Twitter connectivity and using the comment box at lordenarts.com are probably your best ways for me to get the information. The YouTube comments are just so vast, I don't always get all the suggestions. So if you have a really good suggestion, get to Twitter or get to lordenarts.com. Let me know about it. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you back here on Monday with a brand new episode of BrainScratch Case Cracked on the Lorden Arts channel.